everybody. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Reverend Kosho Finch.
So today's topic is going to be difficulties and some of the challenges that we'll face when practicing Buddhism.
I think it's a good opportunity to talk a little bit about the challenges that people face and maybe give a little bit of historic background. Especially in the West, maybe people expect Buddhism to be everything to be peaceful and quiet and easy. And so when they confront difficulties or have obstacles, it can be a bit disconcerting or turn them off to practice. But I guess maybe tonight we can talk about perhaps the historical perspective that is something to be expected.
Yeah, and I think partly it stems from sort of the portrayal of Buddhism in the West. I know growing up, when I thought of Buddhism, I thought, you have nice, beautiful gardens, a monk meditating peacefully in the forest or something, running water, pretty much everything that is branded Zen, really, as being very peaceful and everything. When actually, upon going through Buddhist training, and especially in the Chan or Zen tradition, it's pretty intense. It's pretty rigorous as a model, and I think a lot of that sort of portrayal of Buddhism as being this very peaceful sort of image is partly true, but not the entire story.
I would agree. I think it's probably maybe a little bit too much marketing and movies, but probably our tendency not to focus on the steps it takes to achieve something, but rather look at the end goal. So popular portrayals, even books, probably look at a lot of teachers and think, oh, the person looks very serene or they seem very calm. But it doesn't often focus on the background and maybe some of the difficulties in the training that actually got them to that point.
Yeah. And I think, well, even for Buddhist temples, whenever we go to a temple and we see the main image, a lot of times the image of the Buddha is very peaceful. And so we're always surrounded by those images and portrayals of Buddhas, bodhisattvas, highly attained monastics as being very peaceful, serene, and calm.
It is, and one of the other probably less popular images of the Buddha is when the Buddha was going through austerities and he's portrayed as nearly starving to death, and you can see all of his ribs and very emaciated. That tends not to be the main image at most temples. It actually reminds me of there's a temple in Los Angeles area where they show Shakyamuni as an old man. So there's a standing image of the Buddha, and he's near the end of his life. So it's a very unusual image to see, but probably is something that we need to see and need to remember that he didn't spend his entire life as a young man looking very healthy, as most of our statuary depicts.
Yeah, and it also, that statuary, again, portrays the result of the path, sort of the fruition of all of these efforts, and it doesn't quite show everything that came before it.
That's right, and I think a lot of the things that come before it, there's quite a bit of hard work, and I can definitely say that the monastery, while it is a very beautiful place and can be a very quiet place, is also a place of a lot of hard work, and it's not always, I guess what we would commonly say, enjoyable work, but quite necessary.
Yeah. So how should we start this? Should we start this with some historical examples, or should we start this with personal experiences?
Well, I always like to start with history. So
Right.
I guess I'll start off with, I think, a mutual favorite of ours, Master Xuanzang from China. And my first encounter with this very famous monk from Chinese history was during an overseas studies program in China. And I was in Xi'an, the ancient capital during the Tang Dynasty. And the museum there had a stone relief when they would take rubbings of that relief. And I think it was brought from the desert. And it showed Master Xuanzang with this, looked like a very modern backpack. And that's how I first began to look into his story. But I could tell from the backpack that he was going on a pretty serious journey. Only later would I found out, just how serious and arduous that journey was.
Yeah, and I think for his journey, I first found out actually, what was I doing? I was probably 4 or 5 at the time, and there was an anime edition of his tale, and that was my first. It was actually a Doraemon parody, actually.
Okay.
And that's my first intro to him. But that wasn't necessarily historically accurate, and so it wasn't until I was a lot older that I ran into a documentary on his trip that I realized how hard it was for him to go to India and bring these teachings and translate them into Chinese, which is why we have so many sutras today.
Yeah, without his effort and hard work, we probably wouldn't have most of the texts that we have today, and probably Buddhism wouldn't be what it is. So Master Xuanzang's life, for some of our listeners, is dramatized in the famous Chinese novel Journey to the West, Xi and not totally historically accurate, but a wonderful novel to read, a lot of fun. But he actually wanted to go to India to retrieve a lot of Buddhist texts. But at that time in Chinese history, it was actually illegal to leave the country. You had to have special permission to leave. So he starts his journey, which, of course, we all have to have his efforts to thank for most of our schools of Buddhism today for having brought the text back. But he starts off this journey with breaking the law. He actually sneaks out of the capital, escapes through one of the city walls, and runs off in the night through the desert and encounters numerous challenges just on his way to India, being kidnapped, being held hostage, almost being killed numerous times. And can definitely say the journey was not an easy one in the least. Nothing like what we have to face today with missing a flight or having a flat tire. So
Yeah, definitely. And I'm thinking about when I was watching this documentary about his life, I was trying to put myself in his position. Would I have actually done something like that? And sort of seeing his resolve and how strong it was, which led him to do all of this. Because for him, he had to learn Sanskrit on his own, pretty much, through limited sources and limited teachers. And then after doing so, crossing the desert, getting lost, losing his horse, and kind of just being stranded there trying to survive before eventually arriving at Nalanda University in India and actually being able to study. That sort of willpower, that resolve to seek the Dharma was just so strong. And I really admire that about him.
I do too. It's a really nearly unbelievable story. One of the benefits I think we have from Chinese history was really detailed record keeping. So there are, stories from India, from China. There are records of his travels. So if you look at what he went through, thankfully we have a lot of third-party verification and his own travel journals. But I think probably most of us as modern people would have turned back a long time ago or given up. So it really, I think speaks to, the amount of faith he had, the amount of determination, and that kind of journey really has to be for a reason beyond yourself, wanting to obtain texts or to learn something and to risk your life to that degree. And just the sheer number of, the amount of time that he spent outside of China is also a massive sacrifice. You're going to, if you come back, many of the people are may not be living anymore. The place you're from is probably going to be changed dramatically. And just to be able to spend that much time away is probably something that he had to give a lot of thought to. So I think we really have to think a lot about his drive and determination and what motivated him to keep going all those years. I know when I first went away to summer camp as a kid, I wanted to come home after the first few days. And we probably all have homesickness, but I think he must have had a very strong desire to bring those texts back, and even a very deep understanding of the need to do that for the benefit of the entire Buddhist teaching, and probably a very deep historical understanding of the importance of this journey.
Yeah, definitely, because for him, after he got to India, he could have stayed there. He could have learned all of the teachings there and just stayed, but instead he took his opportunity to cross the desert again. Or actually, did he go by boat? I'm not sure. Anyways, he went through another trip back to China. I think he went by land.
I think it was by land, yeah.
Yeah, it was by land. Thinking about it, because he had to send a letter to the emperor and say, "Hey, I'm back. Please don't execute me on sight. Can I actually enter the country?" After coming back, he spent the rest of his life translating what he had brought back too. So that really goes to show that there was something more to it than just personal attainment or personal learning.
Yeah, even on the journey back, I believe it was through the southern pass. So you're going through the mountain passes, and he writes of certain animals falling off the cliffs on the way back, losing those pack animals, and of course the text they carried. So coming back was also quite dangerous. And then you're right. You face the possibility that you'd be executed, at worst, exiled at best, having broken the law to leave to begin with. It was only the fact that they recognized his sacrifice and the treasures that he brought back in terms of these books that he was allowed into the country. But he could have stayed. It was Nalanda University was the premier place of learning, probably in the ancient world anywhere at that time, and must have been much better than any part of his journey. But to generate that resolve again to go back to China is really nearly unimaginable, I think, for our modern way of life. Just really amazing.
And sometimes after looking at his journey, I know this happened to me twice. So the first time was after watching that documentary about him. The second time was when I downloaded a C beta, the Buddhist canon, the complete, well, not really quite complete Taisho, but pretty much all of the text of the Taisho onto my laptop. I realized I have all of the texts that Xuanzang brought back, plus more, on this little USB thumb drive that I carry around with me. And at that time, I was at the city of 10,000 Buddhas, and one of my friends turned around and said to me, "It doesn't matter if you have all of them if you don't read them." And that's when it kind of clicked. I thought, that's very true. Yes, we have all of these people in the past who brought the teachings back and translated them for us, but it really doesn't do us any good unless we put in our effort to match theirs and really put these texts to use.
Well, I had a similar experience, but I must say, some years before thumb drives were invented, I went in Xi'an, where the translation happened at the Wild Goose Pagoda. I really expected a much larger temple compound, and it's not as big as I had envisioned. But imagining all the translation efforts that went on there, the brick structures that were built to protect the books from fire, they were very humble. It was a very simple structure, very humble surroundings, and just imagining all these monks working late into the night, translating by candlelight, and then comparing that to the times that I complained about studying late or over the weekend in college, really didn't compare. So it really did inspire me at that time to put more effort into my Buddhist studies, just to consider and honor that difficult work, just in going to retrieve the text, and then of course the arduous task of translating. And I think really impressive to me at that time was creating grammars and dictionaries to accompany the translations, and describing why they chose which words they did. The level of detail was very incredible.
Yeah.
And I'm still, I think translators and scholars today are still amazed at the amount of scholarship that went into that project.
Yeah. And I think for me, whenever I learn or study these stories, what I tend to do is try to apply the lessons into my own life. For example, after learning about his trip and his work in translation, I thought to myself, well, there are a lot of Buddhist texts that have not been translated into English yet. And if Master Xuanzang could learn Sanskrit, I mean, the least I can do is start learning Chinese and provide as much translation as I can, right? Especially now with things like Rosetta Stone and classes everywhere. It's a lot easier for me to learn Chinese than it was for him to learn Sanskrit. So it was really an inspiring tale, and I think that was the main thing that I gained from studying his journey.
Yeah, I think it's, for our listeners, I think at the very least, I guess part of our goal tonight is to create that appreciation for all of the hard work that went into the teachings that we have today to study. And then hopefully we'll inspire some people to study Chinese or Japanese or Sanskrit and appreciate the texts in their original language. And we do have the benefit of a lot of translations today, but the entire canon hasn't been completely translated. And, I know that all the translations could be improved. So,
of course, yeah.
And then reading them in their original language, or, well, I should say at least reading them in the Chinese and having some reference back to the Sanskrit gives an even deeper appreciation for the nuance and depth of the teaching that sometimes doesn't totally come across in English.
And yeah, I mean, like you said, there's a lot of work to be done in the field of translation as well. So who knows, maybe in the next, hopefully within our lifetime, we'll be able to see a lot more progress in this. I'm not sure though. It seems like even for China and sort of the translation process from Indian Buddhism to Chinese Buddhism took a few centuries as well. So we might not see a full canon for a few centuries on our side either.
Yeah, I think it did go in phases in China. It's probably a 250-year process to get a really good product. And of course, we have to look at the differences in effort. I think in modern times, you see a lot of scholars working solo, creating translations of texts. So you often don't see agreement on terms across different texts. You have somebody who translated something in the 1930s and somebody else in the 60s, somebody else more modernly. So the language varies quite a bit in the style. And we also don't have, of course, imperial support. We don't have an emperor or empress supporting the project. So our many ways our tools are easier to get. We can use word processors. We do, but we don't often have the ability to bring together, 50 or 60 of the best translators and put them all together in one place and have them work together on that project for 5 to 10 years. But hopefully we'll get there.
Hopefully, yes.
So one of the other arduous journeys, especially in Shingon history, is the founder of Shingon Buddhism, Master Kobodaishi Kukai's journey from Japan to China to retrieve the Buddhist teaching. And actually just recently I was looking at a little bit more deeply into that journey, and Kukai was motivated quite a bit by interest in the Mahavajrayana Sutra, and the text had made its way to Japan during his lifetime as part of the Silk Road trade. but he wasn't able to find anyone who really understood it. So during that time in Japanese history, a lot of books would be brought over, but it would often just come as a shipment. So people hadn't necessarily studied at that point. So he actually, much like Master Xuanzang, generated this resolve to travel to China to find someone who could explain the text to him. So it was also, in many ways, a very, very difficult journey, and again, one that you needed special permission to do. Unlike our modern times, free travel wasn't available to everyone.
So he went with imperial backing, though.
He did, but that wasn't easy to get. So at the time that he generated this idea, he was not. So I guess for a little bit more historical background, when Buddhism came to China and to Japan, to be a official monk, you had to be ordained with imperial approval. So the temples couldn't ordain monks and nuns on their own. They were given a set number that they could ordain per year, and those people had to be ordained on special ordination platforms and receive appropriate imperial approval. So that was I guess, reason or method the government controlled the number of people in religious life. So when Kukai initially began his studies, he didn't have that official ordination. So before he could even go to China, he had to obtain that official ordination recognized by the imperial government. So he obtained that, and of course had fairly low rank at that time, despite maybe his actual accomplishment, and then did get a seat on one of 4 ships leaving for China. So at that time in Japanese history, if you went on one of these ships, they were designed such that you're sort of like a foreign exchange student. So you would go over to China, but the agreement was you would stay for 20 years. So during that time, you were expected to study as much as you could, perfect yourself, and bring back to Japan as much education and learning knowledge as you possibly could to help the government and the country move forward. So Kukai went on one of these official delegations of ships, and at that time, of course, shipbuilding wasn't very good. So their flotilla was caught in quite a large storm, and only 2 of the 4 ships made it to China, but they were blown about 1,000 miles off course. So that was also a pretty big delay. So then he had to make his way overland through China, about 1,000 miles north to Xi'an, where he ended up studying for about 1.5 years in China and bringing back the Shingon teaching. So even during that time, it was the historic record says everybody who came into contact with him, he was constantly busy copying books, translating, getting a hold of any text he could find. And I should probably mention, of course, this is before the Xerox machine. So if you wanted to make a copy of a book, you had to copy it by hand. So the official record says that some people ran into him even as he was waiting for the ship to go back to Japan, and was in that small town waiting for the ship to arrive, still meeting with people, poets, and staying up very late at night copying anything he could find. So I guess we can ask ourselves how many of us would hand copy as many books as we could find just for the pleasure or the benefit of reading them, rather than, as we do today, quite easily ordering them off the internet or going to our local bookstore.
Oh yeah, definitely. It really, after listening to these stories and these examples, it reminds me of the saying "first world problems."
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because a lot of them really are. Sometimes I'm thinking, dang, my library doesn't have the book that I'm looking for. I have to go across town. And then I think of Xuanzang's journey. Well, at least it's not a desert.
Yeah, we don't usually have to walk across a desert full of brigands intent on kidnapping us and holding us for ransom, nor do we have to take an ocean journey with only 50-50 chance of arrival just to obtain a text. So hopefully we can generate a little bit more appreciation for how easy it is to come into contact with the Buddhist teaching these days. But probably something, we can all benefit from is learning those stories, maybe putting a little bit more appreciation, but also effort into our own practice, because truly these books came to us as the result of a lot of, I guess as we say in America, blood, sweat, and tears to obtain. So it's more than something to be glossed over or picked up and perused once or twice. These are texts that were hand copied, lovingly carried, literally on people's backs, and transmitted down to us today. So we probably should have a lot of appreciation for that.
I think definitely the sort of the view of the Dharma and the appreciation for the Dharma in the past has really changed. And this isn't something that's necessarily unique to the United States or the Western world, but it's just because of modernization, everything is so easily accessed now that how we value these teachings really diminishes.
Yeah, I think it's easy now to look things up on a smartphone or a computer. And so this amount of knowledge, we almost do take it for granted. We don't have the same appreciation for it. We don't cherish it in the same way. And, it's common in China and Japan that, sometimes people would go on arduous journeys just to obtain a single verse or, meet with a spiritual being that would just give them a few lines, and they would be so grateful, even just for those few lines, that they would be willing to do things. And, today we scroll through a social media feed and we hardly read the headline or anything of that nature. So one thing I think
the article, go to the comments, of course.
One of the things we probably do need to do is when we do approach the study of the Dharmas, maybe slow down a little bit. I remember when I first started studying Buddhism, a lot of texts coming out of Taiwan had instructions on how to read the text, which was, wash your hands, rinse the mouth first, spread the text on a clean surface, don't put any food or drink next to the text. And it showed proper respect just for the book, to understand that this teaching had a great potential to transform the person. And I remember thinking, well, that's very different than the normal opening prologue or the thanks from the author that you'd see in a lot of other books. So it's good to keep in mind just where the teaching came from and the difficulties that people face in studying Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
So, I guess I think we talked about this topic a little bit because it's typical, I think, for modern people to want things quickly and want things easily. But the Buddhist teaching is now easily available, but it still requires that we invest our time and energy and our minds in understanding it and learning how to put it to practice. So if our ancient examples could go through those sort of hurdles, hopefully we can set aside time to actually read the sutras, and at the very least come up with questions about those texts and then try to search out some answers.
Definitely, yeah. And I think the other thing we can glean from these examples is that a lot of times the path is hard. For the historical examples, these were literal paths. I mean, the path to China, the path to India. Those paths are hard. And then for us, the path to enlightenment is even harder. It becomes an internal path, but it still holds true that there are many obstacles that are going to come. There's going to be a lot of hardship and a lot of things that we're going to have to get over and overcome in our journey. And I think in that it's very easy sometimes to want to give up. Sometimes it's very discouraging, but in this sort of practice, it's something that we have to keep going on and we have to persevere with.
I would agree. Having not been born Buddhist, I had my own path to find the teaching, and it was never easy. Finding texts in the local bookstore back when I started meant you had to go to a specialized bookstore on the other side of the state oftentimes. A lot of these books were not available in the library even back then. So I've only seen it gotten easier, but I find that I still cherish the books that I obtained, all those years back. So finding teachers sometimes still takes time. Back then, it definitely did. But having that perseverance, at least for me, part of that inspiration came from understanding a little bit about the history and background of these texts, and just having the feeling that they were worth studying. And each time I did study them, I found new pieces, new aspects, things that I hadn't seen before. I found the text challenging me in new ways. So that was something that kept me going. But there were frustrating times. There were times that I thought, well, this is too hard. There's other spiritual paths that are easier, that are closer, that are more abundant. But it really did help, sometimes to think, in comparison, the obstacles that I have today are nothing compared to the obstacles of people in ancient times. So I don't have to study by candlelight unless I want to.
I think a lot of similar challenges still exist, though, especially for people who want to learn more about Shingon Buddhism, because it's, like you said in a previous episode, it's really only, in the US at least, on the West Coast and Hawaii. So it still remains very inaccessible to the majority of the population. And teachers who are fluent in English are hard to come by as well.
That's true. The training and actual preparation are not easy. Traveling to Japan, the number of years that is required investing in study, it does take a lot of time. It does take a lot of sacrifice. So, and now, of course, we face another obstacle for bringing teachers in. It's just, basic immigration law, which also reminds me of, Master Xuanzang kind of sneaking out of the country illegally. So there's oftentimes hurdles put in place by our political structures. So it is difficult, and that is true. Currently we're looking at, 4 temples on the West Coast and about 12 in the Hawaiian Islands. So in order for Shingon to spread in the United States, hopefully we can start that or help that along through this podcast and the website and other resources like that. But it will require more people's interests and more people's efforts. So hopefully all of you listening can continue to show your support through subscribing to the channel and telling your friends.
Yes, please share the Dharma. All right. So shall we wrap it up here tonight?
No, I think that would be good. We don't want to dissuade or keep our listeners from actually picking up the sutras and studying a little bit after they listen to this podcast. Hopefully they've been have some renewed energy and inspiration to put more effort into their practice and their studies.
All right. I'll see you next time. Thank you, Sensei.
Thank you.